Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we're looking at Commander Liara Portyr. So Commander Liara Portyr is a 5 mana Boros commander. She's a 5/3 and she says when you attack, that's when you attack, not when Commander Liara attacks, when you attack. Spells you cast from exile this turn cost X less to cast, where X is the number of players being attacked. Exile the top X cards of your library. Until end of turn, you may cast spells from among those exiled cards. So basically, as long as you attack, let's say you're in a pod of 4 players, you attack all 3 of your opponents, all of your impulse drawn spells cost 3 less, and she impulse draws 3 spells. So we're basically going to be a Boros Storm deck with extra combat step spells, and we're going to try to churn through various impulse draws to just keep going and going, beating down all of our opponents. So we're going to need a number of things for these. We're going to need various beatdown cards, especially the ability to put multiple creatures into play. We're going to want evasion so that we can attack with multiple creatures without them getting killed. And we're going to want a ton of fast mana and impulse draw effects so we can keep churning through our decks, and then a bunch of extra combat step spells so that we can keep getting the trigger on Commander Liara to make the cards. One, this X less ability is cumulative, so if we get it multiple times, our spells cost even less than what the first trigger did, potentially making cards that are even more expensive than 4, possibly 1 mana, and we get to keep impulse drawing. So we've got our beatdown cards. These are basically all the cards that I could find that would generate a bunch of tokens. So like Adeline immediately puts a bunch of creatures onto the battlefield attacking, Anim Pakal. We've got our Myriad cards in Hammers of Moradin, Genesee Enforcers, and Worms Crossing Patrol. And then Loyal Apprentice, which will put a Thopter token into play every turn. Then we've got our impulse draws. So we've got impulse draws that break down into a number of categories, but it's mainly about how many cards they impulse draw. So some we have to cast the spells before the end of the turn or we lose them forever. Some we can cast the spells until the next turn. So we've got things like Act on Impulse, Embrace the Unknown, Glimpse the Impossible, Reckless Impulse, etc. We also hypothetically want the ability to put cards from our hand back on top of our deck so that we can impulse draw those cards. So we have things like Brainstone and Scroll Rack to switcheroo the cards from our hand to the library. We also have even more impulse draw. So these are the ones that are basically either they only get 2 cards or less, or they get more than 2, but we have to cast them immediately or we lose them, versus getting more than 2 and we can take an entire turn without having to play them. So this is cards like Ignite the Future, Inspired Tinkering, Commune with Lava. These are cards that are very good. We can, Inspired Tinkering can cost as little as 1 mana, even just 2 off of the initial Commander Liara Portyr trigger, and then it gets us 3 treasures as well, so it actually goes up on mana. Commune with Lava gets us a whole bunch of cards. At base, this is 2 mana to impulse draw 3. Ignite the Future is like 1 mana to impulse draw 3, and we can flash it back. Season of the Bold is basically 2 mana to impulse draw 4 and make a treasure. Memory Vessel wheels into 7 new cards. And then importantly, we do need the mana to actually cast all this stuff. So we have cards like Bergie, and then the opposite side of Bergie also exiles, impulse draws the card, so that can work too. We've got Rose Cutthroat Raider, which at end of combat on your turn, if you attack, you create a junk token for each opponent you attacked. And the junk tokens can be activated for free to impulse draw. And then whenever you sack a junk token, you add red. So this is another 3 red and 3 impulse draws per attack. Then we've got our fast mana. So we're not really interested in cards like, Pyretic Ritual. We want a lot of mana. So that's going to be cards like Sticker Goblin and Mana Geyser. Then we've got our extra combat cards. So all of these cards give us extra combat. Some of them require that we cast them in combat, like Great Train Heist and Savage Beating, but that's fine because Liara Portyr will exile the cards, so we get to use them in combat as well. That's fine. And then we have our actual combos. So our main deal is just going to be churning through a bajillion cards and using Altar of the Brood to mill out our opponent. We also have the ability to use Eternal Scourge in combination with Mimic Vat. So Eternal Scourge, we can cast from exile. So if we've triggered Liara Portyr, that means that Eternal Scourge costs 0. We can exile it using the Mimic Vat. So when it dies, we sack it to Ashnod's Altar, for example, or Breath of Fury. It dies, it goes to exile, we get to cast it for free again. It triggers the Altar of the Brood, we get to go again, and we just get to keep casting Eternal Scourge infinitely to mill all of our opponents, or it just gives us an infinite storm count. Or it's the free creature fodder for Breath of Fury to keep going. Breath of Fury can also keep going via the Thopter tokens that Loyal Apprentice makes or various other creatures. Eternal Scourge also could hypothetically be exiled by Rest in Peace, so that's another card you can have in here. I felt like Mimic Vat was good enough. I also prefer Mimic Vat over Rest in Peace because Mimic Vat will also be free if you happen to Impulse Draw into this one. And then we also have other ways of preventing our creatures from dying. So obviously we need to attack all of our opponents, but there's no guarantee that our opponents won't be able to just block our attackers and kill them. The Reconnaissance will remove our attackers from combat. We don't have to actually connect with any of our attackers. We just have to have attacked them. Similarly, we have Bedlam. Creatures can't block. We just get to keep attacking all of our opponents, and that means as long as we can keep getting extra combat steps, we can just keep hitting our opponents, and this will continue to beat down our opponents until they die. And then lastly, for the same reason, Dolmen Gate prevents all combat damage that would be dealt to attacking creatures you control. Also in the same vein, Loyal Unicorn. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, prevent all damage that would be dealt to creatures you control this turn, and other creatures you control gain vigilance. There's also something to be said for Frontline Medic, which when it and two other creatures attack, it gives all of our guys indestructible. That's basically the same thing as preventing the damage to them. So these are all just various ways that we can keep attacking our opponents with all of our creatures without them dying in combat. Then we have our pretty straightforward Boros land base. A little bit less than usual at only 29, but that's fine. Soken's on here to be something that can turn our, that can be a land that just becomes creatures. Also important to note, Sundering Eruption. So this blows up a land and its controller may search their library for a basic land, but importantly, it also has the text of creatures without flying can't block this turn. So this is another way of getting evasion that just can be part of our land base. So it's basically free. And if we ever Liara Portyr into it, it's only 1 mana. We also have various other protection spells like Grand Abolisher to make sure that none of our stuff gets interacted with. Then we've got a bunch of ramp, and specifically we want ramp in the form of creatures because we want to be able to attack our opponents. So if it's a creature, it wins out over a non-creature, so that's why we're not playing cards like Arcane Signet and Felwar Stone, and instead we're playing these guys. Professional Facebreaker is also very important. We don't necessarily always have the mana to just keep casting all the stuff that we're impulse drawing into. If we're making treasures, that helps us to do it. Also, if we get enough treasures, we can just start impulse drawing with them using the Professional Facebreaker. Then we've got our removal, and we can play more expensive removal than usual because when we impulse draw into it, it costs only 1. So Stroke of Midnight's only 1, Dismantling Wave's only 1. And then aside from that, there were a lot of other cards that I considered. So I considered a number of these cards as more cards that just put tokens into play. I ultimately rejected them because I thought they were too expensive. Same thing with like Showdown of the Skalds as being another impulse draw card. If you Liara Portyr into this, it's only 2 mana. Ultimately, I just cut it for space. Same thing with like Rest in Peace, Mimic Vat was enough. Response Resurgence as another extra combat. The problem with this one is that it doesn't untap our creatures. So yes, we get an extra combat, but none of our creatures actually untap as a result of this. I also decided not to run these fast mana spells to get Liara Portyr out faster, mainly because it doesn't really matter if we get Liara Portyr out quicker. We still need the mana to actually cast all the spells that we're impulse drawing. And then I ultimately decided not to run any of like the mom effects to protect Portyr. I felt like Grand Abolisher and Myral were going to be better for turns where we essentially combo off. There's also cards like Delayed Blast Fireball, which when we cast it off of exile deals 5 to all of our opponents and all of their creatures. Ultimately, this is not a very good card when you don't hit it off of exile, and even when you do, it's not really doing anything that we want. Like, it hypothetically clears the board away, but we had to make an attack before doing that. But all of these cards are potentially very good cards that I would include in the deck. I just cut them mostly for space or being less efficient than other things we were already doing. There was also a number of stacks cards that I ultimately opted not to run, mainly because I felt like this deck was more of just, a straight up combo deck trying to impulse as much as possible. And so I didn't want cards that just kind of didn't do anything when we impulse drew into them. So with all that said, that is going to do it for Commander Liara Portyr in EDH.
The people in it that there is right now, man.